Thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my co-workers, starting from Nikos Kolezakis, a Marie Curie PhD candidate in the frame of the ILDGAP network, then Gaetano Davino, Pierluca Maffettone, and Francesco Greco, Giuseppe Porpora, and Francesco Rusciano, and last but not least, Vincenzo Guida from Procter & Gamble Brussels, where Nikos has performed most of the experiments. And so the primary particle of interest here are vesicles, and briefly, these vesicles consist in a liquid enclosed between lipid surfactant bilayers, and aqueous suspensions of these vesicles are actually widespread in nature and also in industry. And for instance, a very popular example are liquid fabric softeners. And actually, these liquid fabric softeners are more complex than a simple vesicle suspension, so it can be useful to have a look at the structure and composition. Basically, a very initial stage of the production is the so-called white base, which consists in a suspension of cationic vesicle in water with an added anionic salt. So the salt partially screens the vesicle charge, and thus vesicles interact among them with a purely repulsive electrostatic double layer potential. And indeed, we have recently shown that this white base may be understood as a Wigner glass formats, which may explain some intriguing feature of their stability. Next, at a later stage, non-absorbing polymers are added to the wet base, which, of course, promotes a depletion attraction, which compete with the long-range repulsion, and in turn leads to the formation of a gel. And so this opens the way to embed, to use the gel network as a scaffold to include within the sample a variety of other ingredients, and to keep them quite stable across the sample. And in principle, at least, because of course there are a variety of critical issues related to their shelf life, rheology, and aging. And so, of course, to prevent failures like in those snapshots, a fine control of their mechanical and dynamical properties is crucial. And needless to say, also smart and reliable numerical models are very on demand to complement experiments. And so we are currently performing a combined numerical and experimental system to investigate this gel. Here there is, this is essentially the formulation of the investigative system and other experimental conditions. In particular, we investigated the different value of the surfactant concentration, which correspond to different vesicle volume fraction. And on the numerical side, instead, we performed Brownian dynamic simulation inspired by previous works on standard depletion gels, but at variance with those work, we also took in account the presence of long-range repulsion. So our potential is given by the sum of Amorphous potential, which accounts for the depletion interaction, and of the electrostatic double layer potential. And so, concerning the result, I'm going to start from oscillatory shear rheology in the linear regime as probed by small amplitude frequency sweep. And so we can see that always we have that G prime is larger than G double prime at both volume fraction, and also there is somewhat an increase of the moduli that does into a stiffening on increasing the volume fraction. And so the fact that G prime is larger than G double prime is consistent with a primarily solid-like material, and this is in turn consistent with the fact that at the investigated age, the gel network is already well formed, as clearly illustrated by this snapshot from simulation. It is also worth noticing that there is a good agreement between experiments and simulation, especially considering the complexity of the experimental system compared to the relative simplicity of simulation. And so, always keeping in the realm of oscillatory shear rheology, now we go beyond the linear regime as probed by an amplitude sweep. And so we have that at small amplitude, G prime is larger than G double prime, once again indicating an elastic-like regime. But then at larger amplitude, G prime becomes smaller than G double prime. So there is a kind of solid to liquid-like transition, and the crossing point is somewhat indicative of the yielding process. And so it is also in this case, it's worth noticing that essentially the position of this cross point, which is related to yield strain, exactly coincides in experiments and in simulation. And so to have just a look at the structure, essentially in the elastic plateau, the structure is essentially the same as in the quiescent case, but then across yielding, the heterogeneity increases. However, at the largest investigated amplitude, we have that homogeneity is closely recovered. And so to go on, now we deal with constant shear rate. Sorry, Shri. The talk is a bit compressed, quite close to jamming. So I would be happy to reply to your question at the end of the talk. Thank you so much. Okay, so concerning test at constant shear rate, essentially now we focus on flow curves of the shear stress as a function of the Peclet number. So we can see that our results, our data are essentially well fitted by a standard Herschel-Buckley model. And so there is a plateau-like region at small Peclet number, which allows to estimate the so-called dynamic yield stress. Then at larger Peclet number, there is a departure from this plateau and a shear thinning regime. But then a linear behavior, that is a Newtonian-like behavior, is recovered at the largest Peclet number. And so, also in this case, it may be useful to have a look at the structure. Essentially, in the plateau, that is for a value of the stress very close to the dynamic yield stress, the structure is the same than at rest, but then as the stress becomes clearly larger than the dynamic yield stress, the structure becomes quite heterogeneous. But then in the late shear thinning regime and even more in the Newtonian regime, a kind of homogeneity is recovered. So also in this case, we do observe a kind of non-monotonic structural behavior. And so to have a somewhat more quantitative look at the structure, now we focus on the coordination number as measured in simulation, of course, for the two previous tests that I have shown. And so starting from the test at constant shear rate, we can see that there is an initial plateau that is essentially correspond to the quiescent-like configuration, but then as the stress in the flow curve exceed the yield stress, there is a decrease of the coordination number. And finally, at a very large Becquerel number where the Newtonian regime is recovered, the number of contact attains another lower plateau. And so since essentially the central figure, the feature of this configuration is heterogeneity, it can be also interesting to have a look at the fluctuations of the contact number rather than the average. And so we can see that there is a kind, the signal is a bit noisy, but there is a quite clear peak just in correspondence of the more heterogeneous configuration. So also in oscillatory test, the scenario is pretty much is closely similar. We have this sigmoidal shape, and it is interesting to notice that the departure from the first plateau occurs just after or very close to the yield strain we measured before. And so finally, I'm going to conclude by showing some creep test. Here, a constant stress is applied at a given time, and then we observe the compliance. Okay, so here different curves indicates different value of the applied shear stress. So there is a very common behavior a very common early behavior that is essentially a solid-like behavior, and then at intermediate time we can see that for small stresses essentially there is no dependence on the stress. The dependence on the stress starts to be relevant only above a given value of the applied stress, and so this boundary allows to identify the so-called creep yield stress. And so above this creep yield stress, we can see that there is, at intermediate time, a clear increase in the compliance as a function of time, and this increase occurs earlier and earlier as the applied stress is larger than the creep yield stress. So at the largest stress and at the largest time, we can see that there is the emergence of a linear behavior that is indicative of a steady flow, but instead at intermediate stress there is a kind of more complex behavior. And so to understand something more about that is it may be useful to have a look at the shear rate that is of course just proportional to the time derivative of the compliance. So it mirrors all the features that we have already observed, but in particular for the red curve, we can clearly see the presence of this non-monotonic behavior. And so this non-monotonic behavior of the shear stress, of the shear rate, sorry, have been previously observed also in standard depletion gel, and has been ascribed to a kind of resolidification, also to the so-called reentrant solid. So according to this picture, after yielding, there is a transient flow during which another maybe stronger solid is formed. And as a matter of fact, by looking at these snapshots from simulations, we can see that actually the final state, perhaps the reentrant solid, is much more coarsened than the initial solid, the initial state. As for final remarks, I'm going to conclude with a comparison between our flow curves for gels with competing attraction and repulsion compared to standard depletion gel. So we can see that for standard depletion gel, there is we have that the yield, the dynamic yield stress is clearly larger than the creep yield stress, and the resolidification regions lies in between those two stresses. Instead, in our case, we have that the dynamic yield stress is closely compatible with the creep yield stress, and also preliminary results indicate that the upper boundary of the resolidification region may lie above the dynamic yield stress. And of course, I mean, these pictures draws on the idea that on a broad sense, a flat time, long time dependence of the shear rate is not strictly necessary to talk about steady state. In other words, steady states may also take the form of somewhat regular fluctuation, for example, periodic oscillation or stick and slip like fluctuation. But for this system, and also more generally, I believe that further analysis are needed to clarify both the location of this region and the long time fate of this so-called resolidification state. And so to conclude, this is just a list of activities that are currently work in progress, and especially let me mention this, that we are performing a multi-scale study of the dynamics both for the white base and the gel, and we are essentially performing DDM experiments, because we noticed that for this system, DDM performed better than dynamic like scattering. And so these are just a few preliminary analyses made by myself like 1 year ago just for fun, but now better experiment and DDM analysis are in progress in collaboration with Stefano, Paolo Aedera, and Michel Croat at ESPCI in Paris. And that's all, and thank you so much for the attention.